Most men think they're doing enough for their heart. Maybe they hit the gym occasionally, avoid fast food most days, or take a multivitamin and call it a win. But what if the most dangerous threat to your heart isn't cholesterol, blood pressure, or diet, but something far more silent, emotional, and easily overlooked? Today, we're diving into a truth most men never hear, yet it affects their health, relationships, and longevity more than they realize. And once you hear it, you won't think about heart health the same way again. One of the most overlooked heart health mistakes men make is believing that physical health alone keeps the heart strong. We track steps, calories, and supplements, but ignore emotional stress, loneliness, and lack of deep human connection, which research now shows can be just as damaging to the heart as smoking. Another major mistake is assuming vulnerability is a weakness. Men are taught to stay tough, suppress feelings, and carry emotional weight alone. But this silent emotional pressure increases heart disease risk, weakens intimacy, and disconnects men from the one thing that protects the heart most: meaningful emotional support. Most men grow up believing that taking care of their heart is a pretty straightforward equation. Eat the right foods, keep your cholesterol in check, maybe squeeze in some cardio a few times a week, and you're good. It's almost treated like basic car maintenance: fuel, oil, and a quick tune up. But the more we learn about the heart, the more we realize it isn't just a physical pump keeping us alive. It's deeply wired into how we feel, how we love, how we connect, how we allow ourselves to be emotionally seen. And the biggest heart health mistake men make today isn't about food or exercise. It's about what they don't allow themselves to feel. When you ask most men what heart health means, tell you it's about fitness, diet, blood pressure, and maybe genetics. But very few will mention the word love, intimacy, vulnerability, or emotional connection. And yet, science is showing us that these factors can influence your heart as much as diet and smoking do. The human heart responds to emotional life just as much as physical life. So the silent danger for men is not just in the arteries. It's in the isolation. We live in a culture that teaches men from a young age that feelings are something to control, suppress, or keep hidden. Boys are told to toughen up, not cry, not show weakness, not rely on others. By adulthood, countless men are experts at emotional self-containment. They hold everything inside: the stress, the sadness, the fear, the disappointment, believing that handling it alone is strength. But the body doesn't see emotional suppression as strength, reads it as chronic stress. And chronic emotional stress is like slowly poisoning the heart. We now know that loneliness and emotional disconnection increase the risk of heart disease to a degree comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's what decades of research on social health and cardiovascular disease reveal. The heart literally weakens under isolation. And when I talk about loneliness, I don't just mean a man sitting home alone. You can share a bed with someone and still feel deeply lonely if emotional intimacy is missing. Here's where intimacy and sex psychology become part of the conversation, because intimacy isn't just about the physical act of being close to someone. It's the ability to be emotionally present, to communicate needs, to feel safe enough to be vulnerable. For men, this is especially important because for many of them, sex becomes the primary or sometimes the only socially acceptable way to express intimacy. Research shows that men, more than women, often rely on sexual connection to access emotional closeness. It's not that men only want physical intimacy, it's that physical intimacy becomes the gateway to emotional intimacy because it feels safer, less risky than words or vulnerability. But when emotional connection is missing, even active sex lives can leave men feeling disconnected, unseen, and emotionally starved. And guess what? That emotional starvation stresses the heart. We sometimes imagine stress as that jolt of pressure before a deadline or a frustrating day at work, but emotional stress within relationships is often the most potent. Studies show that a toxic relationship can accelerate plaque buildup in arteries, weaken the immune system, increase inflammation, and disrupt sleep, all of which damage heart health. On the flip side, loving touch, healthy intimacy, emotional safety, and romantic warmth can lower blood pressure, regulate heart rhythm, and release oxytocin, the bonding hormone that essentially puts the heart into a calmer, healthier state. Oxytocin isn't just about love. Physiologically, it protects the heart. So the heart actually thrives in love and connection and wears down in isolation and emotional suppression. But here's the fascinating part. It's not the presence of emotions that harm men. It's the refusal to process them. When a man suppresses feelings, the brain keeps the body in a state of hyper alertness. Heart rate stays slightly elevated, cortisol drips into the system daily, and the nervous system works overtime. Men who say, "I'm fine, it's no big deal," while pushing down pain, aren't avoiding the impact, their heart is absorbing it for them. Suppressed emotions don't disappear, the body converts them into physiological strain. Silent emotional burden doesn't just influence the heart, it also shapes sexual and relational behavior. When a man is emotionally disconnected, sexual desire can become less about shared intimacy and more about escape, validation, or tension release. This isn't a moral flaw, it's a psychological adaptation. Sex can temporarily lower stress hormones, so men unconsciously use it as a coping mechanism. But if intimacy becomes a bandage rather than a bond, it can lead to performance anxiety, difficulty maintaining arousal, reduced desire over time, or feeling emotionally empty even after physical pleasure. The heart feels that emptiness too. Think of the last time you felt truly understood by someone. Not just heard, but understood. That inner exhale your body release, that's not just psychological comfort. That's cardiovascular relief. Humans are wired for connection. The heart literally responds to emotional resonance. Great studies using heart rate synchrony show that when two people share deep emotional connection or intimacy, their heartbeats begin to sync in rhythm. That's not romantic metaphor, that's lab-recorded data. The heart listens to the body's love story. But for men, accessing that experience requires something they've often been taught not to do: open up. Vulnerability has been unfairly labeled as weakness, especially for men, but biologically, vulnerability is a stress relief mechanism. When men share emotional truth, cortisol drops, oxytocin rises, the nervous system shifts into safety mode, and the heart relaxes. It's like opening a pressure valve inside the chest. The problem is, so many men never feel safe enough to access that release. But I'm not lonely. I have friends. I have a partner. The question isn't whether there are people around you. The question is, do you let them in? Do they know your fears, your insecurities, your secret worries, the deeper emotional layers? Because loneliness isn't about company, it's about emotional isolation. A man can be surrounded by people and emotionally starving at the same time. When we look at the data on men's friendships, the problem becomes painfully clear. Most men lose deep friendships as they age. Women maintain emotionally intimate friendships. Men often maintain activity-based ones. They talk sports, work, logistics, not inner life. Emotional intimacy gets funneled into one relationship, the romantic partner. That puts enormous pressure on that relationship. And then when emotional needs go unmet, leads to resentment, communication breakdown, and silent suffering on both sides. And again, the heart pays the price. Now, here's where it gets even more fascinating from a sex psychology perspective. Research shows that men in emotionally supportive relationships have healthier testosterone levels, stronger immune functioning, sexual performance, and longer lifespans. Love and health are biologically entangled. Emotional closeness increases desire, not just for sex, but for connection. When men feel emotionally safe, their sexual experiences become more fulfilling, more connected, and less performance-driven. The heart responds positively when intimacy isn't a transaction, but a shared emotional experience. There's a reason why men who experience sudden heartbreak or intense emotional loss sometimes suffer what's known as broken heart syndrome. The stress literally stuns the heart, causing symptoms similar to a heart attack. Emotional pain has a physical signature. The heart isn't neutral in our emotional world. It participates in it. So we have a generation of men who believe they're doing what's necessary to protect their heart by focusing on the physical only, while completely neglecting the emotional dimension that may be doing the most damage. They go for runs, lift weights, count macros, take supplements, but they aren't talking to anyone about what keeps them up at night, aren't expressing their needs in relationships, they aren't allowing touch to be tender, sex to be emotionally safe, or connection to be nourishing. They're training their body while the emotional weight keeps tightening around their heart. I once heard a cardiologist say, heart attacks rarely come just from clogging of the arteries. They come from clogging of the emotional life. And while that may sound poetic, the biology backs it. Men who score high in emotional suppression show higher inflammation markers in the body, one of the strongest predictors of heart disease. Emotional honesty isn't just good for relationships. It can save lives. If men learn to experience intimacy beyond the physical, if they understood that emotional expression is a strength, not a burden, they would not only improve their relationships, they would improve their heart health. When a man opens up emotionally, his partner often feels more seen, more connected, and more sexually and emotionally fulfilled. Emotional connection enhances sexual chemistry, and sexual chemistry enhances the kind of emotional bonding that protects the heart. Why men who practice affectionate touch beyond sex have healthier relationships and healthier bodies. Something as simple as hand holding releases oxytocin, lowers blood pressure, and synchronizes heart rhythm. 20-second hug can initiate a measurable cardiovascular calming response. Couples who regularly engage in affectionate touch, not just sexual touch, experience lower stress, higher relationship satisfaction, and better long-term heart health. Intimacy, in all its forms, is heart medicine. So the real question becomes, why aren't men taught this? It's not because the science is new. It's because cultural conditioning hasn't caught up to the science. We're still raising boys to disconnect from the very emotional tools that protect their health, their relationships, and their longevity. We're still rewarding stoicism and emotional silence instead of emotional intelligence and connection. The data is undeniable. Isolation ages the heart. Intimacy protects it. Imagine if men were encouraged to talk about their emotions with the same enthusiasm they talk about fitness routines or sports stats. Imagine if male friendships included emotional check-ins, if relationships normalized vulnerability, if men didn't feel shame in saying, I need support, or I'm struggling. The impact on heart health would be enormous. It would change the way men love, the way they live, and the length and quality of their lives. Connection isn't a luxury, it's a biological necessity. The heart is an emotional organ as much as a physical one. When men begin to understand that, they stop seeing vulnerability as a risk and start seeing it as nourishment. They stop viewing emotional openness as a threat to masculinity and start recognizing it as heart protection. The strongest men aren't the ones who carry everything alone. They're the ones who allow themselves to be real, to be held, to be known. Because when a man opens his heart emotionally, he's not just improving his relationships, he's giving his heart the care it's been quietly craving. There is one shift men can make that will transform both their emotional and physical heart health. It's learning to see connection as strength, to understand that intimacy isn't just something that happens in the bedroom. It happens in conversation, in trust, in touch, in being fully seen. And the moment a man allows himself to experience that depth of connection, his heart responds, not just in feeling, but in health. So maybe heart health isn't just a medical conversation. Maybe it's also a conversation about how we love, how we connect, and how we allow ourselves to be human. And the men who embrace that truth will not only live longer, they will live fuller, more connected lives with hearts that are not just strong, deeply alive. Most men don't recognize the moment it begins the slow, subtle drift away from emotional openness. It rarely starts with something dramatic. More often, it's a tiny moment. A boy falls, gets hurt, and hears, stand up. A teenager feels heartbreak, and someone jokes, don't be soft. A man struggles emotionally and is told, handle it like a man. And with each of these moments, something gets silently rewired. Not in the muscles, not in the brain alone, but in the heart. Because the second keynote we're exploring today is this: men are taught that vulnerability is a weakness, but biologically, emotionally, and sexually, Vulnerability is one of the most powerful things a man can offer, not just to others, but to himself, and the cost of rejecting vulnerability is far greater than most men could ever imagine. When we talk about heart health, most men imagine arteries or cholesterol, but your heart isn't just impacted by what you eat or how much you exercise, it's profoundly influenced by how much you suppress or express your emotions. Vulnerability is at the core of this. Men have been conditioned to wear emotional armor, but that armor is heavy, and carrying it day after day tightens the chest, not metaphorically, physically. Shows that emotional suppression activates the sympathetic nervous system, increasing heart rate and blood pressure. Emotional honesty activates the parasympathetic system, which calms the heart. So when men avoid vulnerability, their nervous system stays stuck in a stress response, sometimes for years. Many men think vulnerability is about crying or confessing deep secrets, but it's much simpler and more human than that. Vulnerability is the act of allowing yourself to be emotionally seen. It's saying, I'm hurt, I'm scared, I need help, I'm confused, or even, I care about you, without hiding behind humor, anger, or distraction. It's letting someone see the truth of you, not the performance. And biologically, the heart responds to that kind of emotional truth. When we let ourselves be emotionally seen, oxytocin rises. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, doesn't only affect the brain, it protects the heart by decreasing inflammation and lowering blood pressure. Emotional vulnerability is cardioprotective. But to appreciate why vulnerability is so powerful, we need to understand what happens when men avoid it. When a man hides his inner world, his emotional life doesn't disappear, it internalizes. The body becomes the storage unit, the heart becomes the vault, and anything we store emotionally eventually leaks into our behavior, our relationships, and our health. Men who avoid vulnerability often experience emotional leakage in 3 common forms. Some channel it into anger or irritability. It becomes the only emotion that feels acceptable to express. Others withdraw, becoming emotionally numb to avoid the discomfort of feeling too deeply. Some turn intimacy into performance, relying on sexual connection as the only gateway to closeness because verbal or emotional intimacy feels too exposed. But none of these strategies solve the emotional need. They just silence it temporarily. And silence has consequences. From a sex psychology perspective, vulnerability is essential for true intimacy. It's not just about deep conversations. It's about feeling safe to be yourself with someone. When men aren't vulnerable, physical intimacy becomes disconnected from emotional intimacy. It can still be pleasurable, but it misses the feeling of closeness the nervous system craves. Research shows that men experience sex as most fulfilling and deeply bonding when emotional vulnerability is present, not just physical arousal. Sex with emotional openness increases dopamine release, deepens attachment, even improves sexual performance because the body stops operating in a stress state and switches into a pleasure-safe state. Let's talk honestly about the strong, silent man stereotype. It's glorified in movies, admired in culture, and encouraged in childhood. But biologically, it's one of the most damaging expectations men face. Silence forces the nervous system into chronic self-regulation, meaning the body keeps trying to calm itself without external emotional support. Humans aren't designed to self-regulate alone. We're co-regulating beings. Our nervous systems need others to stay balanced. When a man shares his emotional experiences with someone who responds with empathy, his heart rate begins to normalize. There is real science behind why speaking your truth eases your chest. The biggest misconception men have is believing that emotional vulnerability will make others lose respect for them. Yet research consistently shows the opposite. Men who are capable of emotional openness are rated as more trustworthy, more secure, more attractive, and more desirable as long-term partners. Women often list emotional availability and vulnerability as more important for connection and long-term intimacy than physical traits. And men, even if they rarely say it, feel safer, happier, and more connected around other men who show vulnerability because it signals emotional permission. It's safe for you to be human here too. But because men fear vulnerability, many end up in emotionally one-sided relationships. They rely solely on their romantic partner for emotional connection because that's the only place they feel safe enough to let the guard come down even a little. But relying on one person to meet every emotional need is unsustainable. Partnerships thrive when both partners can share, but they suffer when one feels emotionally locked out and the other feels emotionally overburdened. Emotional suppression doesn't just affect the man, it strains the relationship that was supposed to be his emotional safe space. And here's something rarely talked about: vulnerability fuels desire. When two partners share emotions, fears, dreams, insecurities, and experiences, sexual chemistry grows. The brain associates emotional safety with sexual openness. When you feel emotionally safe with someone, your body relaxes into pleasure instead of bracing for judgment or rejection. Vulnerability makes intimacy richer, more adventurous, and more fulfilling. Without it, sex stays surface level, functional, or repetitive because the emotional connection isn't deep enough to evolve the experience. Men often assume vulnerability has to be grand or dramatic. A big confession, a powerful, tearful moment, a movie is scene revelation. But vulnerability is most impactful in micro moments. Saying, I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Admitting, I'm afraid of losing you. Sharing, I had a tough day and it hurt more than I expected. These small emotional truths strengthen connection. They build relationship resilience. They build heart resilience. And yet, many men fear that if they let someone see their weakness, they'll lose power. But emotional invulnerability doesn't create strength. It creates isolation. The fear of vulnerability robs men of support, connection, intimacy, and belonging. And the irony is this: people don't fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with truth. Vulnerability isn't a crack in the armor. It's the doorway through which love enters. Men also underestimate how their vulnerability influences their children. Boys learn how to handle emotions by watching men, not by what men tell them. If a father never shows sadness, fear, or tenderness, his son learns that feelings are unacceptable. If a father expresses emotions honestly and responsibly, his son learns that feelings are human and manageable. Vulnerability is inherited behavior. Physically speaking, the body reacts to vulnerability much like exhaling after holding your breath too long. When a man suppresses emotion, the chest tightens, breath becomes shallow, and muscles tense. When he speaks truth, the diaphragm relaxes, breath deepens, and the heartbeat stabilizes. It's as if the body recognizes honesty as safety. One of the most fascinating findings in neuroscience is that the brain treats emotional pain and physical pain almost identically. Rejection, shame, abandonment, and emotional neglect activate the same brain pathways as physical injury. Hormone oxytocin, released through emotional connection, physical touch, and vulnerability, acts as the body's natural painkiller. Your heart doesn't only need nutrients, it needs connection. So why is vulnerability so difficult? Biologically, vulnerability feels like exposure. It triggers the ancient survival instinct that says, if they see the real me, they might reject me. Historically, belonging was essential to survival. Rejection meant danger. Today, rejection isn't life-threatening, but the brain hasn't updated the wiring. It still reacts to emotional exposure as risk. This is why vulnerability initially feels uncomfortable. It's a biological misinterpretation of danger. The more men practice vulnerability, the more the nervous system learns that emotional openness is safe. That's emotional conditioning, just like physical training conditions muscle memory. Imagine a man who never expresses worry, fear, or sadness. On the outside, he looks strong. On the inside, his heart is battling constant tension. Now imagine a man who says, I don't have all the answers, and lets someone hold space for him. On the outside, he looks human. On the inside, heart finally rests. Which one is stronger? Men often don't realize that their lack of vulnerability is the very thing creating distance in their relationships. Partners can sense emotional walls even if they can't explain them. Emotional intimacy stops growing when vulnerability stops flowing. People fall in love through revelation, not performance. If you hide your inner world, others don't fall in love with you. They fall in love with the version you perform. And eventually, performance becomes exhausting. Here's the breakthrough. Vulnerability isn't about losing control. It's about gaining connection. It's not about oversharing or spilling every thought. It's about honest presence. The ability to say, here's what's real for me right now. That level of emotional presence deepens trust faster than any grand romantic gesture ever could. And when trust deepens, the heart relaxes. When the heart relaxes, intimacy expands. When intimacy expands, sexual satisfaction rises. When sexual satisfaction rises, emotional connection strengthens. And when emotional connection strengthens, life feels meaningful, held, supported, and shared. That is the loop men miss when they avoid vulnerability. Vulnerability threatens love, when in reality, vulnerability is the oxygen love breathes. If men shifted their understanding of vulnerability from weakness to strength, their relationships would transform. Their mental health would improve. Their physical heart health would benefit. Their sexual experiences would deepen. And their lives would feel less like endurance, more like belonging. Vulnerability is not about exposing wounds without boundaries. It's about opening a window to your inner experience so that the people who care about you can step inside. It's about letting love land. It's about letting support in. The heart has two jobs: to keep you alive and to help you feel alive. Most men only allow it to do the first, but the second requires vulnerability. Strength isn't how tightly you hold everything in. Strength is having the courage to let yourself be known by others and by yourself. Because when a man finally removes the armor, not only does he discover he can breathe again, he discovers something even more powerful. The people who truly love him prefer him without it. And in that moment, the heart isn't just beating, it's living.